One of the most delightful moments that I had in ministry was at a business meeting, surprise, surprise, and then in the following days and weeks, I think, at a home of a couple. During what had led up to this wonderful moment was actually pretty terrible, actually. I had just come home from holidays. I was about 28 years old, first pastorate. Come home from holidays when at 6 a.m. that first morning back, I got a call from a guy in the church. I need you to come over to my house right away. Quickly got dressed, went in my vehicle, a half-hour drive to his place, and I got there. And he told me that his wife had been unfaithful and that he wanted me to be there when his wife woke up. Nothing quite prepares you for that moment. There's nothing in seminary that's gotten you fully equipped, and when I heard what had been going on, I was devastated and shocked, and I felt really inadequate in that moment. How on earth was this couple going to make it? I had no idea. I didn't really feel that I had the strength or the help or the resources. I could give them encouragement and wisdom, but it would take a miracle. It was going to take a miracle to see this marriage come back together. Fast forward 6 months. After a lot of hard work, prayer, confession, repentance, working details out, the wife who had been unfaithful had worked with me to prepare a statement, and she came to that church business meeting, and she read her confession, and she apologized. And then we threw a party. We threw a party because Jesus says that there's the angels in heaven rejoice even when one sinner repents. And so it seemed just appropriate that we celebrate, and that we have a party, and that's exactly what we did. And so we had this party. We also recognized that there still needed to be some ongoing work. And so in the days, or I think a week later, there were some of us who went to their home, and we prayed with them and for them, and there they committed one another again to make their marriage work. And to this day, they have a wonderful family, they're married, and they've seen God's great work in their lives. In Joshua 24, when we come to this passage, Joshua is calling for a renewal of the covenant. Now, a covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. It's greater than a contract. It's this binding together. It's this total allegiance to one another. I'm being there for you, you being there for me. And throughout the Bible, God relates to his people by way of covenant. At creation, he gives his word to Adam, and he calls him to obey his word, and that there's blessings for obeying it, and there are curses for disobeying it. But when Adam disobeys, God begins a process of how he will remake and renew all things that are broken. He starts then with Noah, and he says that he'll wipe out evil and he'll begin a new creation, but Noah must be a man who honors and values life. From there, he commits to Abraham, that he'll make Abraham a great nation, and through him, this new creation and this new world will come about. He'll give him a land, and that land will be the starting point from which he will renew all things. But Abraham is to be devoted to the Lord. As time goes on and Abraham's descendants end up in bondage and slavery in Egypt, the Lord rescues them, calling them his very own treasured possession. And he covenants with Israel that he will be their God and they will be his people, and they are to obey his law. And he gives them 10 words, 10 commandments that they're to follow to get the patterns of slavery out of their lives and to be formed into the image as the true Son of God that Israel is intended to be. Now, after all of the blessings that they have received, having received a land, having been brought into it, inheriting it, having seen God deliver them, now Joshua sees that the greatest threat to Israel is not the trials that they had in the wilderness, for there were lots of ups and downs. When there was food, they were thankful and fine, but when they lacked water and bread, then they grumbled and complained against Moses and the Lord. And whenever there were problems, they would cry out, "Why did you bring us in the wilderness to die?" And they would get ornery and cranky. But Joshua knew that the problems that Israel suffered with, if they could not endure in times of trial, how were they going to handle the times of prosperity in the land? That now they were entering into a land where they had cities that they didn't build and produce and vineyards that they never planted, and they were the recipients of all sorts of blessings. And how were they going to survive and move forward in the face of prosperity? And Joshua 24 is a call to be renewing the covenant. Now, when we talk about renewing the covenant, we're not talking about this idea of rededication where we have an altar call and you want to just raise your hand and walk the aisle and come forward again. That's not what we're talking about here, though that has a sense of what some people would understand being rededicated means. But we're talking about something far more profound and far more deep than just that. And I want us to see what it means to be renewed in covenant relationship with God, Him to us and us to Him. And three things I want us to see. First, I want us to see that we need to remember God's faithfulness. Verse 1, as Joshua summons the people, we're told he gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. Now, Shechem is an important place in the Bible story. In 500 years earlier, in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham had been called to leave the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, beyond the Euphrates River, and the Lord had said, "Go to the place that I will show you." God had brought him into the land of Canaan, and he said that this would be his land, and God would make Abraham's name great, and that he would bless him, and through him all the world would be blessed. And in Genesis 12, verses 5 and verses 6 and 7, we're told that when Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, that time the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And here God was saying at Shechem, some 500 years earlier, I'm going to give you a man who has no children, no descendants. You've got your wife, you've got your servants, you've got all of your property, but here's my promise to you. I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants. It's going to be yours. And you're going to know that I am your God. And now some 500 years later, as Israel comes back to Shechem, some 2-3 million of them, the promise that God had made to Abraham, that I'll make your name great, your descendants will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and as great as the stars in the sky. Now they were assembled at Shechem, all these people, a reminder of God's faithful promise that He had kept His word. And so in keeping His word, now here they were. But there's more to going on than just this sense of remembering God's faithfulness. God had told, through Moses, He had told Israel that when they came into the land, that they were to assemble back at Shechem in Deuteronomy 11:29, that they would assemble back at Shechem, and that the Levite priests would stand, some of them on Mount Ebal, which was on the one side of Shechem, and the others would stand on Mount Gerizim. And that what they would do is they would repeat the covenantal promises of Deuteronomy 28 and 29, and that the Levites on Mount Gerizim would shout and proclaim all of the blessings of the covenant, that if the people obeyed, here's how God would bless. And the Levites on the Mount of Ebal, they would shout and remind the people of all the curses that would come if they broke covenant. And back at this place at Shechem, where God had revealed Himself to Abram, where He had promised to give them the land, God had covenanted to be their God, but He was calling them to be His people. And this was His great reminder. Follow me, trust me, obey me. And now Joshua does this at Shechem. He reassembles the people. He reassembles all of the leaders so that they would pass on these words. And he commands them to remember how God had been faithful. He outlines it from verses 2 all the way down through verse 8, that God had brought brought Abraham out of the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, when he worshiped other gods, that he brought him out and he brought him to this land. And that God had brought the people of Israel out of Egypt and out of bondage and out of slavery, and he had brought them to this land. And God had delivered them from the Amorites and rescued them and brought them to this land. And God had been faithful. And so just now, as they enjoy all of the prosperity of houses that they did not build, and gardens and vineyards that they did not plant, Joshua reminds them in their prosperity, look it, God has been faithful. And he calls them to remember God's faithfulness, because by remembering God's faithfulness, that is where we find the strength to be faithful to God. We don't muster up the faithfulness to God from in and of ourselves, but we find that God's faithfulness is the foundation for our faith in him. That when God is faithful and we see his faithfulness, it enables us and strengthens us so that we would be faithful to the Lord. So that's the first thing we see. But the second thing that we see is that Joshua then commands the people, choose whom you will serve. He says to the people in verse 15, and if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. When Joshua is calling the people to serve the Lord, we hear the echoes actually from the book of Exodus, where the people served Pharaoh, and Moses had gone to Pharaoh and said, let my people go so that they may serve the Lord. This idea of serving the Lord, it's not merely an idea of just doing something for God. It is the idea of worshiping God, being devoted to God, adoring God, and praising God. And Joshua calls the people to adore and worship. But they have to make a choice as to whom they will worship. John Calvin, in his Institutes, one of the most famous lines, I'm paraphrasing, he says that the heart is an idol factory. The heart always longs to worship. It will always create and find something by which it will worship. Now, we may not worship idols and statues and images, but we find things that we invest our time and energy and resources and money into, so that we find some sort of fulfillment or purpose or encouragement or satisfaction. And when those things become ultimate things, whether they're work or family or comfort or ease or possessions or happiness, then we make for ourselves something that becomes ultimate, an idol. It can be a concept, it can be a feeling, it can be the worship of our lives and having our best life and not having anyone constrain us. Joshua knew and he had seen how the foreign gods had been so destructive. The Old Testament and biblical theologian, scholar Greg Beale has written a book. It's entitled, We Resemble What We Revere. And in it he traces this theme of biblical theology the book is called We Become Like What We Worship. And in it, he traces out this idea that we resemble what we revere, either for ruin or restoration. And in that, what happens is, when we worship, we become like the thing that we worship. So in Psalm 115, verses 4 through 8, we're told that people who worship idols, what they do is they worship an idol who it has eyes, but that idol cannot see. It has ears, but that idol cannot hear. It has a mouth, but it cannot speak. It has a nose, but it cannot smell. Hands and feet, but it cannot move. And then in verse 8 of Psalm 115, we're told, and those who worship it become like it. In other words, a lifeless, dead, formless, powerless idol will form you into a lifeless, powerless person. What you resemble, what you revere, you will resemble, either for ruin or it will renew you. The worship of God is intended to remake you into the image of God's Son, to display his glory and his greatness. And Joshua here is saying, listen, choose whom you're going to serve. You could choose the gods that Abraham had when he was back in Ur of the Chaldeans. You could worship the gods that were existing in Egypt and the people brought out. But me, I've seen what those gods do. I see how they destroy lives. I see how the pursuit of happiness doesn't lead to happiness. I've seen how the pursuit of wealth never leaves you satisfied with enough. So as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. We're not going to intermarry with the nations around us and be co-opted by their worship. We're not going to give in to the pressures that are all around us, because we know, my house knows, that the Lord our God is the God who remakes us through the worship of him. So choose whom you will serve. And the third thing we see in dedicating ourselves to this covenant of renewal is that we must throw away our idols. Several times Joshua says to the people, verse 14, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. And the people respond in verses 16 through 18. They answer, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. God's the one who rescued us. God saved us. God delivered us. We're not going to worship the gods of Egypt or the Amorites. We're going to serve the Lord. To which Joshua replies in verse 19, a shocking statement. You are not able to serve the Lord. I've seen you. I've seen you in the wilderness and how you had these ups and downs, how fickle your hearts are, that you could trust God in one moment and forget him the next, that you could say, I am trusting the Lord, and then Moses could go up the mountain for 40 days, and during those 40 days while he was up on the mountain, you fashioned a golden calf and you bowed down and worshipped it. After the Lord had given you his 10 commandments and you had said, we're going to do everything that the Lord has commanded us, Exodus 20:18, we're going to do everything God has commanded us, which he had said in Exodus 20, verses 2 through 6, worship God only, and don't make any images of anything to worship it. And you couldn't even keep it for 40 days. You're not able to do this. So the people respond with offense. No, we can serve the Lord, verse 21. To which Joshua replies, then you must cast off your idols. You have to get rid of them. Verse 23. Cast them away. Just as God had commanded you to devote everything in the land to destruction, so devote these foreign gods who will lead you to destruction. Get rid of them. Do not let the foreign gods shape you. And this is a good reminder for us. What would Jesus find if he were to come into our home? He were to open our drawers, go into our offices or our rooms, pick up our smartphones and look at the apps and social media presence, the private communication that we've had. Even what would Jesus find in our browsing history? Would he find that we have dedication and allegiance to him? Or would he find foreign gods that we've been pursuing, trying to find a pleasure in? When Joshua says in verse 19, put away the foreign gods, you're not able to serve the Lord your God, for he's a holy and jealous God, and he will not forgive your transgressions or your iniquities. Joshua isn't saying you've committed the unpardonable sin and you can never be forgiven. What Joshua is saying is you can't be forgiven when you're cherishing sin still in your heart. When you say, I'm still going to hold on to this, and I'm sorry, Lord, but you keep doing the same thing, there's no forgiveness there for cherished sin. It's not enough to say sorry, there has to be change. And so this is why in verse 22, Joshua calls the people not to willpower, but to accountability. He says, I want you to be witnesses against or for one another. I want you to be accountable to one another because I'm about to die, and we see that in the verses that follow in verses 29. Joshua, he dies, and the people are left to their future. And how will their future go now that Joshua is gone? They must hold each other accountable to the covenant that they made. That Joshua won't be there to hold them accountable to it. They are witnesses, and they function much like what you do at a wedding. When you're at a wedding and you're there and there's a group of people, you've gathered them to witness your vows, and you make promises. I will love you and I'll be faithful to you in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer. No matter what, I'm there and I'm bound to you and you're bound to me. And in that moment, the people who sit there function as witnesses. And what we do when we go to a wedding is that we're reminded that when this couple comes to a point where they have struggles, when they have hardships, when they face trials and temptations, or when they're feeling like they're ready to pack it in, the people who are at that wedding, they should be the ones who come into their lives and say, hey, do you remember what you said? In sickness and in health, richer or poorer, better for worse. You made promises, and those promises you need to keep. And I'm here to help you do that. Now, what do we got to do? Joshua is saying, I'm pleading to you like a witness from a wedding. These are the words that you've said. Remind each other of them and stick to them. And all of these things are intended for us to see the glory of Christ. The place that Shechem had gone, we are told in Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, when Abram had arrived there, at the oaks of Moreh, the trees there, that God had appeared to him and revealed himself to him and promised to him his faithfulness. And we're told throughout Joshua that they come back to Shechem, and there they see the trees at Moreh, and they're reminded of the promises that God made. And just as there were the trees at Moreh, so there are the trees not only of Shechem that remind us of God's faithfulness, but there is another tree that reminds us of the faithfulness of God. For God sent his only Son to another tree, a tree where he would lay down his life and show covenant love and faithfulness. And that covenant love and faithfulness that he would show and that he would display was by taking on himself all of the breaking of the covenant, and that he would then be our God and keep covenant with us. But more than that, every time we take of the bread and we drink of the cup, when we partake of the Lord's Supper, what we are saying is this. It's not only, Lord, I remember you. I remember your faithfulness. But it's now I look into my own heart and my life, and I, as Paul says, examine myself. And I see in my own heart, how am I in relation to you, Lord? This is why he says, for whoever takes the cup in an unworthy manner, takes the bread in the unworthy manner, he does it against the Lord. Because this is an act of covenant renewal. It's of covenant faithfulness. Every time we take of that cup and we drink it and we eat of that bread, we are saying, I am rededicating myself again afresh to you. I'm examining my heart. I'm living rightly. I want to know your blessings. And when we partake of these things, when we know of his cleansing, when we know of his dedication to us and our dedication to him, then what we hear is we hear the words again of Joshua, which are our words. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.